I don't want to start where we are today. I want to look out 5, 10 years and say, okay, this digitization trend is accelerating as fast as we think it is. Okay, and it's moving fast down the road. Not only in this and not only in cars, but also in the digitization of the electric systems and energy systems in general. Ships, planes, all modes of transportation. And so when you look at that, I want you guys to start off just answering the question, trying to answer the question from your viewpoint, 5 to 10 years down the road, what is the business model going to look like in your area of expertise? I mean, with LNG, whatever your area is.
Yeah, I'll maybe start where Jim left. I mean, I think when you consider the reason for regulation of the electric industry initially, right, was the idea of a large network, economies of scale, one monopoly provider is your most efficient thing. Let's kind of move forward there. I think if Texas has shown nothing else, it is the case that is not the case anymore, if it ever was, certainly in the generation and the retail businesses. And I sort of mentioned SDG&E earlier. I think for Sempra, it was sort of eye-opening having bought Encore and looking at how Texas works, looking at all of the top-down policy initiatives in California and saying, well, why don't we just be a wires and pipes company? I mean, we call ourselves an energy infrastructure company. Infrastructure is one of those words that can mean whatever the hell you want it to mean. I think of Sempra as an energy delivery company, and that kind of meshes with, I think, what we think our core competencies is in both electricity and in natural gas. We're not on the commodity side of it. I think the reality, to Tom's point, is the pace of change is going to do nothing but accelerate. And being a former regulator, the pace of regulation does a very poor job in keeping up with that. And you can rattle off the list of things that frankly are still the debates at places like FERC, John, that are yesterday's debates about capacity markets, and the guy from Sacramento is up here. I mean, IRP is a fool's errand at this point, for crying out loud, right? And where you have these debates over designs of things that are meant for a planning horizon much longer than the world is already today, much less than it will be in a couple years, there just needs to be a recognition that that's the case, and that the more that a regulatory system or a governmental system seeks to try to say, hey, this is what makes sense today, by the time you get through that horizon, you're already past it. I mean, we've seen it a little bit even on the grid side. You know, in Texas, we've had the struggle of keeping up with the technology in oil and gas in the Permian Basin to get the grid built fast enough. We had the same problem in wind power. There will come a day when, as we go through that planning process, even for new transmission, we're going to get to the end and say, hey, wait a minute, do we still need that thing? Because we started it 4 years ago, and a bunch of stuff happened kind of since then. And so I think that's going to be the challenge, is the regulatory world modifying itself to a recognition that it's not all a natural monopoly anymore, and that pace of change just gets faster and faster.
Good. So let's pass along, and then we'll come back, and you'll give me the solution.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that's going to change, and people will be amazed at it, is right now the word data interoperability seems to be very mystic. But we do it every day when we exchange an address file out of Outlook. We don't think anything about it. And what George mentioned last night at his speech was that as we get out of our swimming lanes, we're going to see a common set of data elements that are crossing those swimming lanes. And he talked about the different modules. Well, we're working with the construction industry on the module for progress payments. We're working with the DOE on the data module for how a PPA's performance measurement. All of those will start to be exchanged between systems without regard of whether or not it came from an Oracle system, a Salesforce system. We just want the data. And the more the data start to be exchanged, the more the appetite for the data will be required. And the banks will start to say, and the surety companies will say, look, if you can give me the data that allows me to understand my risk better, faster, and quicker, I'll give you a discount. If you're going to make me manually rekey everything and you're going to give it to me 4 months late, my price is going to be a lot more. And I think the regulations in California, we are taking a lead. We actually have a law being proposed now, SB 598. I'm happy to talk to anybody about it. But it's forcing every state agency to report into the state using the same XBRL data standard that the federal government recognizes. And with that kind of compliance requirement, they're going to have to do it. And that's the data we would be looking at as we look at the construction data as well as the performance data being reported by the energy departments.
Yeah. So standardized financial data. Go ahead.
So Tom, you asked about 5 to 10 years from now. I think 5 to 10 years is too late. We have to change today. And I'll give two specific examples in our transformation of our business model at Engie. And one is a good example, one is a bad example. So I talked a little bit about the transformation of our business. I talked about all the capabilities that we've acquired, and we went to, I can't name the name, but a grocery store chain. We wanted to sell them everything. And we got the C-level people in the room, so all the right people were in the room. We prepared a fantastic presentation. I mean, if someone who built Microsoft PowerPoint saw that presentation, it probably eyes would water. It was that good. and it was presented really well too. We talked about demand response. We talked about data. We talked about, you know, how we can optimize their buildings' consumption and how they can save money. Fantastic presentation. And the CEO at the end said, "Thank you. You know, you talk about this stuff, I don't understand any of it because we're in the business of selling lettuce. And what we want to make sure is the lettuce looks bright, so someone, whenever they come to our grocery store, they want to buy it. So I don't know if this demand response, if it's going to make the lettuce look not so fresh, that's bad for our business." So we couldn't win that deal. We went back, and I think it piggies back on what Jim said. It's customer centricity. Is that really what the customer wanted from us? The answer is no. And as an industry, we're terrible at explaining what we do to our customers. We talked about demand response. I mean, most of you have kids, I'm assuming. Do you try to talk to your kids about demand response at the dinner table? Nobody really cares. And I think we have to, as an industry, untether ourselves from that meter that's on the side of our building. So the good example is we went back and said, okay, people really doesn't want that. People don't have anything to do with a kilowatt hour. I mean, we're in this business, probably half of the room here cannot explain what a kilowatt hour is because you don't really care. What matters to you is it has zero intrinsic value for you. It has extrinsic value for you because it can be turned into something that's valuable for you, such as light, such as climate control. So we decided to sell to our next customer, instead of the kilowatt hours, we said we're going to sell you zero carbon transition as a service. And we're going to sell you energy as a service. We're going to sell you sustainability as a service. So I can name the name of this customer now because it's public. So it's Ohio State University. We went there. We said, you know, you're good at academics. You're good at research. So that's what you should focus on. You should not be focusing on managing your energy infrastructure. So we paid them $1 billion cash so that they can spend all that money on academics, on more affordable education, and attracting students into their campus. And we said, we're going to manage all of your infrastructure for the next 50 years. You don't have to worry about the kilowatt hour. We'll take care of it. We'll make sure you consume less. We'll make sure you emit less carbon dioxide. All of that we're going to handle for the next 50 years. And everybody loved that kind of deal. We actually were, I think, more than 50% ahead of the next bidder. So I think we have to focus as an industry to focus on what matters for the customer, and that means changing the entire business model for our organizations.
Yeah, and I totally agree. We have to change now. We have to start changing. We've already started changing, so it's an evolution. What I'm looking for is maybe 5 years down the road, what does a good business model, and you described a perfectly good one with the university. So
yeah, it does start with the consumer, and does start with design, as Jim said in his opening, his last D. And let me give you an example of bad design that would have happened, but fortunately didn't. Last week, FERC issued an order on rehearing. They initially issued an order on storage, on battery storage, and what consumers could do with those storage assets. And in that order, they said that they could, do under FERC's jurisdiction, whatever they wanted to do with it. They could use those assets to provide wholesale services if they wanted to. Even if it was a customer who owned a battery that was behind the meter, they could do that. And the utility, the industrial and utility industry, EEI, and the co-ops, and the munis, and the National Association of Regulatory Commissioners all petitioned FERC to say, no, you shouldn't allow consumers to do that unless we, the utilities in the states, permit them to do it. And FERC said, no, I'm sorry, this is our jurisdiction, and we believe that consumers have the right to participate in those wholesale markets with those assets if they want to. And so we're not going to change that where a state under the petition from their local utility can force them to opt out of that and stop the consumers from doing that. So that's not the model we want. The model we want is hopefully to make everything that can be competitive to be competitive. And I've said that for a long, long time. Anything that can be a market within a market structure, it should be in a market structure, although it should be a well-designed structure. You just don't deregulate. You just don't throw consumers out there to the wolves or to the forces of competition. You ensure that you have a proper structure. FERC tried to do that with respect to the wholesale markets. We went from an economic regulator to a market regulator, where we set up a market structure with an enforcement office that was headed by a former U.S. attorney that had his number 2 person was a former counsel to the FBI, that we went from 4 or 5 people in the enforcement office during the Western energy crisis to 200 people when I left. And traders that didn't do the right thing knew that they were in trouble, because we fined people like Goldman Sachs $400 million for not doing the right thing while I was there. Sure. So you have to have those kind of protections in place for consumers to make sure that the markets function for their benefit, but it can be done.
Yep, and I agree. Competition's the key on that one. Go ahead.
To echo some of the sentiments here, I mean, any sufficiently complex supply chain, which energy obviously has been represented throughout today, seems to be, requires innovation, implementation, integration across all facets of that supply chain in order to really progress. The overarching prohibitor on that is regulation, right? That's the speed control. That's how fast can you innovate, how fast can you integrate, how fast can you implement. And where we, one thing I didn't mention is our platform, Signet, happens to be the first blockchain-based platform offered by an FDIC-insured bank that was actually launched in January. And of course, our responsibility is to work within the confines of our regulators. The financial system is well regulated. Can't do anything without the approval of our regulators. And in order to really make anything happen and put it out to market, part of the process is onboarding the regulators as partners if you can't go through them or work through their framework that they've already addressed. And that's chipping away at the problem. When regulators become innovators, that's when we start to see a lot more change. And you kind of hit on it with FERC trying to innovate in the way that they're structuring the wholesale markets. Once those regulators become innovators, and it just takes effort to chip away at their idea and potentially just wait for the new class of new generation to come through and come in with some innovative ideas potentially as well. So that's not really an answer to where we see things in 10 years, but if I were to say, I would say that in 10 years we're going to be looking at, from a financial services perspective, we're going to be looking at moving cash from bank account A to bank account B as a service and not an onerous function with a lot of overhead and hands-on tracking things throughout the process.
Great. That'd be an important part of the puzzle. Go ahead, Jim.
I guess I'm going to, the first thing I'll say, I'll give you the pessimistic view of over the 5 to 10 years. Energy is a political commodity. Electricity specifically is a political commodity. It's not a commodity, it's a political commodity. Within a zone of reasonableness, regulators, policymakers, legislative members will allow things to happen. Outside of that zone of reasonableness, I think it was the term we were using in the Western power crisis,
yes,
it became trouble. And I think there are some macro trends, and some of it comes back to sort of where we as a society are, right? The modern economy requires, not just for businesses, but for each and every home, each and every family, a continuous supply of sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy. And when we get out of that band, and so the trend I think that I've seen in the last few years is, it's like there's all these moving parts, and so people are starting to push back into it more than allow the market to develop. We saw that in the UK, our parent company, British Gas, the May government imposed a price cap on electricity and natural gas effectively. In probably if you go back to the day, the UK was the opening philosophical conversation about energy markets. And now they've come back, and it wasn't a Labour government. The Labour government, if it gets elected, would nationalize things, right? It was the Tory government that's saying we're going to cap prices because we see that the just about managing, which is the JAMS, is the term that her government would say, had to be, sort of defended and protected from the market. So there is this huge debate going on where and I said this last week, Daniel Jorgen wrote the book Commanding Heights. Markets win, socialism is over. We're going to just allow markets to rule the roost. That may not happen in the next 5 to 10 years. There's an argument that says that's not where we're going. If I had my druthers, I would like to see markets come out ahead, although markets properly structured and properly maintained. Because if you become just doctrinaire market, I think you're missing the point of this whole industry. Two things that we would need to see, right? If that's the positive trend line. First of all, I think that the rightful definition of what is a natural monopoly and what is infrastructure. I could see the day in 10 years that, in fact, maybe even delivery service is value-based priced as opposed to cost of service priced. But that is a very, very interesting conversation about how we would come at that. If I look at how the regulatory models are changing, it's not great. I mean, New York has been at the REV process since I think my oldest was in elementary school, and she's now a freshman at A&M. So that's not a positive outlook. A very progressive commission, lots of thoughtful people haven't been able to figure out how to move that ball forward in a way. The other thing that we're really going to have to work around as an industry, and it goes sort of to the financial side of this question, this industry is really good at building, at financing, constructing, engineering big 1,000-megawatt assets, save for maybe a big asset in Georgia. But generally, we've done a good job of building large. Did I say something that was? No. Okay.
You're good.
So okay.
You keep going, man.
So, but the challenge, and I was at NRG, right? And so NRG had this very question, which is how do we go from building 1,000-megawatt power plant to building 1,000 1-megawatt power plants? Because the accounting, the lawyers, the finance, the engineering, the construction, the systems are set up because we are focused on safety, right? And it was good that the gentleman from Austin Energy made reference to where you need to exit, right? That's something that a safety-based culture will do. But in this world, we're going to have to figure out how to finance quickly in a world where the capital markets don't really like to work that way. They really, it's hard to make that all work. And I think that's going to be a fundamental issue. I do think, you see what Engie did with Ohio State. I think those kind of creative options can come out of it, but regulators and sort of the market and the rest of the players in the market have to figure out how to make that work, recognizing that credit is ultimately the key to all of this.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, let's pivot just a minute and kind of get down to a specific question, and we'll finish up. The question I've got, and you hit on it, is we sell electricity to mass customers based on volume, kilowatt hours. Does a customer know what a kilowatt hour is? I think we'd all agree no, not really. No clue. And so what are we selling? And to me, part of that business model, let's just take a pure monopoly wires company that's been stripped down and doesn't provide any competitive service. Their fixed cost is what, 95%? It's fixed. But I'm selling my product, wires delivery, on a kilowatt hour basis.
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, this goes to this question of narrowing what is the monopoly. And then we are going to have to change the financial and regulatory model. I mean, the gas industry did this a little bit earlier. I think the idea that we're going to continue to push all this volumetric makes no sense. And it's challenging because, again, the consumers in our markets that can least afford a big demand charge or a big customer charge are the ones we're going to have to help and figure out how to make sure they can get through that transition. But the idea that I'm interconnected to the world's biggest battery, which is the grid, and I don't pay, if I don't use it very often, I pay just a little bit, doesn't make sense, right? I have to pay my fair share. It's a tough one. I mean, the PUCT looked at this a couple of years ago. There was a good study, I think Christensen Associates looked at this study and started to say the message. My view is we have to start transitioning customers. Don't do it all at once, but start to move down that path of moving towards fixed cost or customer charge, demand charges, so even households recognize the value they get from interconnecting to that battery.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not to say in my prior life, I mean it was something I hammered on a lot, because when you look at the states that are, I mean California again, perfect example, purely volumetric, right? It's hard to come back from that once you get a lot of people that have made economic decisions based on it being purely volumetric. And so we had been progressively trying to move wires rates up to a little more fixed charge component, little discussions of demand charges and the like. And again, for me, somewhat it goes back to, well, what is regulation supposed to accomplish? There's a view that regulation is the enlightened regulators deciding what the world should look like. That's kind of California. I think the hallmark of Texas, though we haven't always gotten it right, is that it's supposed to be if there were competitive wires, how would that industry price itself? How do competitive network industries price themselves? Well, we have plenty of examples of that. We have cell phone service, we have internet service, we have cable service. I pay the same amount whether I use that phone or watch HBO 1 day or 30 days.
Yeah,
Right.
And so you kind of get to, the markets have actually answered in other industries how regulation should work, and then you deal with your social issues on low incomes and others through explicit mechanisms like we did at one point with things like system benefit funds.
But that value has to go both ways. When I worked for Solar City, we did get out a gigawatt every year. We were putting out a gigawatt a year in 3 or 4 kilowatts at a time of systems, and we were fighting the utilities who were fighting us on net metering charges because they were saying, oh, well, the guy next door is subsidizing you. No, it didn't work that way. In fact, I did studies. I had some of the best economists and distribution engineers in the country do studies to show that actually we were putting more benefit in the system than they were paying us back in the net metering charges. So ultimately, you need to provide the consumer value, the prosumer, as George was talking about last night in his presentation. You need to provide the prosumer the value that they're putting back into the system. If you're going to, value what they're getting on their side, then the value's got to come to them as well if they're putting value back.
I'm seeing everyone glaze over. So go ahead.
Can you guys go about the FERC approval of storage? It's a play. Let's push forward. It just happened. There'll be lawsuits, whatever's going to. Let's assume that it's happening. How would we go about realizing that in the whole ecosystem? What would happen if that was live? Players are coming in, aggregators. It's Tesla's music, Dream. Everybody's storage is playing into the. How would that happen? What would need to happen?
Who wants to go? Jump in.
I'm gonna talk a little bit about it, and probably goes a little bit to the other question as well. How the utility business model has to change. Today, you can name a utility, and it's basically they manage distribution service. They have to change, and that 10-12% regulated return has to go away. They're going to have to evolve from being a distribution service operator to a distribution service orchestrator, which basically the difference is they facilitate the data exchange between the market data, the availability of all these DER resources, the batteries, and around the active management of DERs, how they connect to the grid, which one gets dispatched at the right time. The value of distribution has to be a commodity. It's not supposed to be something that's fixed. So when you take all of that and that utility business model changes, and the likes of us or Direct Energy probably then evolve into energy service providers, in which we just basically deliver the data that comes from these orchestration, deliver that to the customer. All of that decision making on a real-time basis is done by machines. There's some high-level decision making that's being done by the customer, and we deliver that information, and we own the customer relationship and customer engagement model. I think that's how it has to change. It's a big change, a lot of pain and blood there, But I think as the regulators also has to be a little bit more brave to facilitate this change. I mean, we went through this in Europe. We had nuclear power plants in Belgium. We said, you know, these are in the rate. We haven't paid for these assets yet, and you know, regulators said, well, sucks to be you. These are actually the people's plans, not your plans, and game's over.
So any comments on how this comes to bear? The approval of FERC, a 3-to-1 vote to have storage. Let's assume it's happening. Nobody's fighting anymore. It's happening.
Well, first of all, I mean, a lot's going to change. It may be an order from FERC. I don't know that means that everyone would fall into line immediately to allow a behind-the-meter storage asset to participate in wholesale markets. I mean, there's a lot of technology. I mean, all the service providers to ISOs are probably like, okay, that's great. We now have a lot more data points to manage. So, you know, if you're a database provider to PJM, that's probably a good thing. But I will make the case that in the same way I think the Bells, Ma Bell initially, at least as I understand it, you know, prevented people from connecting their own equipment. I wouldn't go so far as to say because FERC has issued an order that it's going to be as simple as, well, I have, you know, a bunch of Tesla Powerwalls, and next thing you know, I'm sort of calling up Andy Ott at PJM and saying, do you want to buy my electricity? I don't think that'll, I don't know.
I think it absolutely will happen. I mean, in fact, Andy Ott at PGM is already doing it with water heaters. So I'm sure he can do it with batteries if he can do it with water heaters. So
if the local utilities help facilitate it, I think, and that's
no, that's the whole point. The local utilities don't need to facilitate it. That is the whole point. That's in fact where we won the war before the Supreme Court with demand response. The local utilities don't have to do a thing. A consumer has the right to bid demand response into a wholesale market, and the local utility basically can't say anything about it.
I hope you're right.
No, I know I'm right. I'll give you the U.S. Supreme Court case that says I'm right.
I understand.
FERC v. YEPSA, right?
I understand the law. I'm just saying in terms of how quickly that will.
No, and the problem is the utilities will try to frustrate it because it is against their interests. But that frustration is something that again is against the law. It is in fact against the law if they're doing that.
But my point is, let's assume that it's going to happen.
Yeah.
What would that new world look like? Would the retailers be the retailers? Would the wires companies continue to be the wires companies? What would it look like?
Well, what's ringing in my ears is the comment I think Dave made on the last panel, which is because of reliability standards and the obligation to serve and all of that good stuff that goes with being the monopoly, the economic stuff is great until it starts causing people on a feeder to lose power. And that's the reality.
Well,
and you know, we are in a world, all of this today, all the digitalization, all of the information transmission, everything else requires a reliable local power grid as well as a bulk transmission system.
And we know what will happen with the politicians.
To Jim's point.
To Jim's point, if you don't have reliability.
And let me add this kind of with all the other, the prosumer move to that and everything else, reliability will get new aspects as well. I mean, it is one thing to the point of what are utilities selling? For my kids, who, by the way, don't understand demand response because I got to follow a 13-year-old and 10-year-old around the house turning off every light. What electricity provides them is about 4 hours of fortnight on a Saturday, right? And if the power goes out, we could not have water for 3 days and nobody would have noticed, right? But no internet for fortnight is kind of the problem. And so as much as modern society now means the need for the reliable grid is more than it ever has been, as you now start talking about people exporting to the grid, that's a whole different thing when I lose power, and I had hoped to get that $2,500 megawatt hour price for exports from my solar panels. And if the guy next door to me also has the solar panels and screwed up my feeder, you've got a whole nother range of reliability complaints. And so I'm not quite to the point of thinking that you can relieve that kind of obligation from the utilities in light of the demands for reliable service.
That is the tension. So if energy storage is the vehicle, who manages it?
I would argue it would be the distribution service orchestrator would be the active management of the DERs, in this case, the battery.
Well, I guess I would say it would be the energy service provider selling energy as a service, operating within the protocols and rules of the distribution system. And so again, it's whoever's going to manage it is the person that provides the most value to the customer, because it's the customer's right. I mean, so if there's a partnership, with an OEM, Centrica would love to have a conversation with General Motors. I mean, we're happy to. We have a lot of, we're big load in the UK, and so we'd love to do that. I mean, I think that's where, again, come back to the design phase. As long as there's no frustration of all of this engagement into the market, right? I mean, that's my fear, right? There's little things that will happen. Call me on Saturday, but not on the third Saturday of the month, that kind of stuff, right? As long as there's none of that, then again, to me, it comes back to how and who is best helping that individual consumer to design their own path. And one of the things I learned running a large, residential electricity business in Texas, and, a good boss of mine said, the problem with a lot of people in our industry is we always are focus groups of one, which is, I'd never do that, so that's a bad idea. The fact of the matter is just a multitude of ways people want to approach these questions. And how I trade off affordability and sustainability and resiliency or reliability is unique to only my situation and my 3 kids and my wife, right? It's just, that's who I am, but I should never impose. If I do, I'm going to make a big mistake in building a big business. If I impose my thought on what I should do with my electric vehicle and my pool pump and all the other stuff on everyone else, I'm making a mistake. And the person who's best able to allow those millions and millions of decisions to be made will win in this marketplace.
Yeah. Thanks.
Add something, and when I said the distribution service orchestrator would manage the active management of the DER asset, I think I want to add how that information and how the customer's needs are met, how the information gets delivered to that customer, that would be the energy service provider. The distribution service orchestrator would be managing the asset, making sure how the local grid interacts with the transmission. All of that would be, I think, mostly going to be machines. It's not going to be people at the behind of it, because you're going to be making instantaneous decisions right away with thousands of assets. So it's just going to be AI managing all of that, and the relationship of how that gets delivered to the customer and the entity that makes sure the customer's needs are met is going to be the service provider.
So with that, thanks to the panel. That was a great panel.